하겠습니다. 먼저 첫 번째 발표는 여러분들이 너무나 잘 아시는 브루스 커밍스 선생님을 자리에 모시도록 하겠습니다. 커밍스 선생님은 나와주시기 바랍니다. 커밍스 선생님은 콜롬비아 대학에서 박사를 하시고 유니버시티 오브 워싱턴 그리고 유니버시티 오브 시카고에서 교수 생활을 하셨고 한국전쟁의 기원이라는 그 책으로도 굉장히 유명하십니다. 뿐만 아니라 영국 BBC의 한국전쟁 다큐멘터리를 만드는 데도 굉장히 큰 공헌을 하셨습니다. 브루스 커밍스 선생님의 강연을 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank Francis and all the other people who organized this wonderful conference and who invited me to come all the way to Korea during the rainy season. Anyway, I'm going to present my paper. Many of you, I think, will have read it. And for the interpreters and translators, I'm going to skip some sections of the paper, so I'll let you know what I am skipping. I also think my paper falls under what Vice President Al Gore calls an inconvenient truth. North Korea is the one threatening people with nuclear weapons these days. But I think the most important point I want to make is that the armistice was itself shaped by American nuclear threats and blackmail, and it's been sustained ever since by American nuclear deterrence. And North Korea, as I said in the paper, is probably the only non-nuclear country in the world up until 2006 to be threatened and blackmailed so consistently for the last 60 and more years. So the primary legacy of the armistice is therefore not peace, but a continuation of the extraordinary violence of the Korean War through continuous threats by the US, North Korea, and South Korea to start the war again. Just last April, amid a lot of North Korean rhetorical threats, President Obama sent B-52 and B-2 stealth bombers over Korea, dropping dummy bombs on islands off of South Korea, with the Pentagon making sure everybody knew that these planes were nuclear capable. Around the same time, military leaders in Seoul told the press that they possessed highly accurate cruise missiles that could enter any window in Pyongyang, an implicit threat to decapitate the North Korean leadership. As usual, these threats were in response to a wild barrage of heated rhetoric and claims from Pyongyang, threatening, among other things, to launch nuclear-tipped missiles against the United States. We all know that the North Koreans are infuriating. They castigate their enemies. They thumb their noses at the most powerful country in the world. They make wild threats. They're impudent. Perhaps they're insane. Part of this is the image they seek to project. Game Theory 101 tells us that when both sides have nuclear weapons, and thus the weapons can't be used without tempting mutual suicide, the point is to generate fear in the mind of the enemy that he might be willing to use these terrible weapons anyway. And in such a circumstance, appearing to be mad, a pose of madness, is very useful. Partly also, this is the image of North Korea that the American media also like to promote. Excuse me. They always take the North Korean bait and hype the threat with endless images of goose-stepping soldiers, starving children, manic leaders, and gross exaggerations of Pyongyang's military capabilities. I'm going to skip the part about Hollywood, but a number of recent Hollywood films also make North Korea into a goose-stepping enemy. A different picture emerges from the violence of the Korean War and its aftermath. Before its first nuclear test in 2006, as I said, North Korea was really the only country so consistently threatened and blackmailed. This began during the war in 1951 and has continued down to the present. I want to talk about this today and in every opportunity that I have, because discussion of this phenomenon in the United States and in the American media is so rare as to be virtually non-existent. The vast majority of Americans and many well-informed people know nothing about American nuclear threats and nuclear deterrence for the last more than 60 years. Yet North Korean leaders have lived for that entire time with a figurative but permanent red glow across their horizons, the recurrent specter of instant nuclear destruction by the United States. And thus it is that the armistice was forged in the context of American nuclear threats and sustained ever since by the same methods. I'm going to skip the part on reaching armistice and go to the section titled Nuclear Blackmail. At the time, this is on page 232, at the time the United States, at the time of the armistice, the United States brandished the biggest weapons in its arsenal. On May 26, 1953, the New York Times featured a story on the first atomic shell shot from a cannon, which exploded in French Flat, Nevada, with 10 kiloton force, more than half the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. A few days later came the, quote, mightiest atom blast ever exploded at the Nevada test site. Some speculated it might have been a hydrogen bomb. The Nevada tests were integral to this atomic blackmail, a way of getting a message to the enemy that it had better sign the armistice. Formerly secret materials also illustrate that in May and June 1953, the Eisenhower administration sought to show that it would stop at nothing to bring the war to a close. In mid-May, President Eisenhower told the National Security Council that using nuclear weapons in Korea would be cheaper than conventional weaponry, and a few days later, the Joint Chiefs developed a long paper with 5 or 6 scenarios for escalating the war with nuclear attacks if the armistice was not agreed to. Nonetheless, there's little evidence that Eisenhower's nuclear threats made any difference to the communist decision to end the war, which had come in March before this panoply of threats. Furthermore, Eisenhower himself was entirely ambivalent about using nuclear weapons, as opposed to threatening to use them. In May 1953, Eisenhower discussed using nuclear weapons in Korea several times with the NSC, but ended up preferring to bluff, to put out hints and warnings that the U.S. might use these weapons, but not to go all the way. In the meantime, his generals stepped up the bombing campaign, hitting North Korea's large dams, as I'll discuss in a minute. On May 20th, 1953, the Joint Chiefs presented again a new war plan involving the use of, quote, hundreds of atomic bombs against both North Korea and China. But a few days later, China and North Korea agreed to terms acceptable to the U.S. Amid no evidence that the nuclear blackmail made much difference in their decision. After the war ended, Eisenhower and Dulles still tried to maintain in published accounts that nuclear threats delivered through third parties ended the war. But Ike's son, John Eisenhower, who drafted his memoirs, admitted that we were conjecturing rather than putting our finger on a real truth. In her new book, Jean Edward Smith quotes Eisenhower saying that he didn't take advice about the use of nuclear weapons from John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, or the State Department, and in fact told them to cut out all this fooling around about using nuclear weapons. I interviewed Dean Rusk in 1986 for the Korean War documentary that was mentioned a minute ago. He told me that when he became the Secretary of State in 1961, he had his staff comb through the files from 1953 to see if Eisenhower's threats had any reality. And he came to the conclusion after scouring the files that they didn't make any difference, these threats. But the Eisenhower administration was central to the first introduction of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. I'm going to skip the next section except for on page 234, the second paragraph. In the fall of 1951, the U.S. carried out Operation Hudson Harbor, still a secret project that sought to establish the capability of using atomic weapons on the battlefield. And in pursuit of this goal, B-29 bombers were lifted from Okinawa in September and October 1951 and sent over North Korea on simulated bombing runs, atomic bombing runs, dropping dummy A-bombs or heavy TNT conventional bombs. They wanted to see, quote, the actual functioning of all activities which would be involved in an atomic strike, including weapons assembly and testing, leading, ground control of bomb aiming, and things like that. The results were that the results showed that the bombs were not useful primarily for technical reasons. You couldn't get large masses of troops that could be destroyed by an atomic bomb. The ones that you did get were easily destroyed by large conventional bombs. But one can imagine the steel nerves required of leaders in Pyongyang watching a lone B-29 simulating the attack lines that resulted in the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 6 years earlier, each time unsure of whether the bomb was real or a dummy. Korea was a kind of proving ground during this war, not just for Hudson Harbor, but a young man named Samuel Cohen watched the battle for retaking Seoul, recapturing it the second time in early 1951, and thought there ought to be a way to destroy the enemy without destroying the city. He became father of the neutron bomb. That same year, Robert Oppenheimer, who of course was the father of the American atomic bomb, went to Korea as part of Project Vista to look at the feasibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And after the war, South Korea became the primary American proving ground for testing the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The simple reason being that unlike the Central Front in Europe, the other side did not have nuclear weapons, and therefore their use in war games and in actual plans for war became standard operating procedure. The next section has to do with the targeting of major dams in North Korea, and I'm just going to skip it and show a couple of slides related to it. Let's see where we are here. That's the atomic cannon that I referred to. How do I get it to go the other way? Okay. This is the Toksan Dam being opened with American bombing. It resulted in a flood that went 27 miles, wiped out tens of thousands of huts and large numbers of villages. 3 dams were hit during this period, and when you look at the official Air Force histories, they were very proud of this particular event and thought it helped to bring the war to an end. Sorry, I can't seem to figure out where I am in this. Okay. Well, I'm a little mixed up with where the slides are. Once again, that's the atomic cannon, as long as we're on this particular slide. The order of my slides has somehow been reversed, so I don't quite know where we are. All right, if I can stop there. This is... could you show me how to work this? Well, you've seen a number of the pictures. One of them was of Wonsan at the end of the war. The other was of Pyongyang, looking like Hiroshima after American bombing. This is a partial table of the destruction that the U.S. Air Force visited on North Korea. These percentages represent cities destroyed, and they are higher than either the German or Japanese percentages in World War II. In terms of cities like Berlin or Dresden were not as destroyed as North Korean cities. The U.S. and Britain also used the same techniques they had developed for firebombing and incendiary warfare that they had developed regarding Germany and Japan, which were major industrial countries and belligerents in that war, and used them on North Korea, which of course was partially industrialized, but was not at all a country like Japan or Germany. That is Wonsan, Pyongyang. This is the Chungangcheong, the central government building in Seoul after the second reoccupation. You can see that it was burned but not destroyed. A lot of damage happened in Seoul and elsewhere from bombing and from the war, but nothing like what happened in North Korea. This is Grayling's book on the bombing of Germany and Japan during World War II. This is Michael Walzer's very widely known book, Just and Unjust Wars, in which he calls the American bombing of North Korea a war crime. These are Chris Marker's pictures in 1957 of North Koreans rebuilding downtown Pyongyang 4 years after the war ended. Chris Marker died a year ago in July. This is still the central government building in downtown Pyongyang. More rebuilding in 1957. These are widows, 2 widows, presumably with their daughter. Widows and orphans, of course, were created by the hundreds of thousands in North Korea. Here is Marker's photo of them pitched against North Korean mountains. This is John Foster Dulles looking at the Kim Il-sung before the war began. I'm not quite sure why that photo is there. This is a backpack nuclear weapon. It weighs 60 pounds and has the force equivalent of 10 kilotons, or half the size of the Hiroshima bomb. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. There we are at the atomic cannon. This is another Marker photo of a North Korean woman looking at the Sputnik in 1957, announcing that the communist world had gone ahead of the non-communist world in technology. Let's not worry about those. We can cut the slides off now. I'm sorry, I took quite a bit of time trying to figure out where I was in those slides, but let me come back to page 236. One official American history wrote, and I'm quoting, "So we killed civilians, friendly civilians, and enemy civilians, bombed their homes, fired whole villages with the occupants, women and children, and 10 times as many hidden communist soldiers under showers of napalm, and the pilots came back to their ships stinking of vomit, twisted from their vitals by the shock of what they had to do. Then the authors ask, is this any worse than, quote, killing thousands of invisible civilians with the blockbusters and atomic bombs? Not really, they say, because the enemy's savagery toward their own people was even worse than the Nazis' campaign of terror in Poland and Ukraine. This is an astonishing distortion. In fact, the North Korean and Chinese armies were considerably better than the American and South Korean armies in terms of trying to protect civilians. In any case, The argument seems to be that these people are savages, so that gives us the right to shower napalm on innocent people. And it turns out that right at the top of the American government, whether it's George Kennan or General Matthew Ridgway, they refer to Chinese and Koreans as savage and arrogant. And Admiral Libby told Truman he negotiated for 7 months at Panmunjom with talking animals. White Americans came from a racially segregated society where no Asian men talked back to white men, and the very idea of negotiating with such people was odious and outrageous to the Americans. I'm going to skip to the bottom of page 237. One of the forgotten aspects of the war in America was how deeply unpopular it was when Truman went out of office at the time of the armistice and thereafter. He had a 27% approval rating in the Gallup polls. In the history of Gallup polling, that was always the lowest rating until George W. Bush hit a low point of 22% in 2008. Furthermore, as Rosemary Foote has said, in the popular imagination, Americans had never lost a war. From 1776 until 1950, the U.S. had been very successful in employing force and thus had no need to develop the art of diplomacy and compromise. So it fought the war in Korea to a standstill, eschewing any serious diplomacy to achieve a lasting peace. It may have been a stalemate on the ground, but it was widely seen by Americans as a defeat. In the nation's capital, on the day the war ended, reporters said people met the armistice with, quote, a collective shrug of the shoulders. In New York, TV cameras, crews showed up at Times Square to find desultory citizens who had to be coaxed into shouting an approval of the peace of the armistice. The next day, an Iowa court ruled that there had been no state of war in Korea because Congress had never declared one to exist. I'll now skip to the top of the next page, page 239. A conference to work out peace arrangements in Korea and Vietnam was scheduled in Geneva in 1954, but John Foster Dulles had no intention of signing a peace treaty with North Korea and China. In 1986, I interviewed Hugh Alexis Johnson, who was a top negotiator at Geneva. Johnson told us that Geneva was to the American delegation merely an empty exercise to be gotten through. I asked him, how do you prepare for a conference when you have no hope that negotiations are going to change anything? And he said, oh, you make your speeches and you also try to make sure that Korean Foreign Minister Pen is well established and knows what he's supposed to do, and you don't let Syngman Rhee sabotage it. We're going to move forward to page 241. One of the fascinating things about the National Security Council records that we now have from the 1950s is that at several high-level meetings, Dulles worried that the U.S. would not know how a new war might start in Korea, and he worried most that Syngman Rhee might start it. These statements from Dulles started in 1953 and went up until 1957, when at a meeting Dulles said Rhee might start a war, and 2 weeks later, quote, if war were to start in Korea, it was going to be very hard indeed to determine which side had begun the war. It was in this specific context that Dulles agreed to the Joint Chiefs' desire to place nuclear weapons in Korea. Hotheads like Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung would think twice before starting a war that would rain nuclear destruction on the peninsula. In January 1958, that's the next paragraph, the U.S. positioned 280-millimeter nuclear cannons and nuclear-tipped Honest John missiles in South Korea, and a year later the Air Force permanently stationed a squadron of nuclear-tipped Matador cruise missiles in Korea. Of course, these missiles aimed not just at North Korea, but also at the Soviet Far East and China. But by the mid-60s, defense strategy in Korea was pinned on routine standard plans to use nuclear weapons very early in any new war. As a 1967 Pentagon war game script put it, quote, the 12 ROC Army and 2 U.S. divisions in South Korea had keyed their defense plans almost entirely to the early use of nuclear weapons. You all know that in January 1968, the North Koreans seized the American spy ship Pueblo, capturing the crew and keeping it for 11 months. The initial reaction of American decision makers was to drop a nuclear weapon on Pyongyang. And in fact, all the U.S. F-4 fighter planes held on constant alert at Kunsan and other airfields were loaded only with nuclear weapons. U.S. atomic demolition mines, ADMs, were defensive weapons designed to be used in South Korea, quote, to contaminate an advanced area and to stop an armored attack. These weighed 60 pounds and yet had a 20 kiloton explosive force. These ADMs were carried around in backpacks, as you saw, by special teams. And Freeman Dyson, who was one of the most interesting American experts on nuclear weapons, called these, quote, the most dangerous of all tactical weapons because they can be moved around in jeeps, making it impossible to assure their physical security, and the enemy might end up nabbing one of them. This fact bred a mentality of using them or losing them. In other words, even a relatively small North Korean attack might be cause enough to use these ADMs unless they were to fall into enemy hands. I want to call particular attention to the next paragraph where Richard Walker, who was the American ambassador to Korea during the Chun Doo-hwan regime, linked nuclear weapons in South Korea with the defense of Japan. He said the presence of American conventional and even tactical nuclear forces in Korea helps to confirm strategic guarantees for Tokyo and to discourage any Japanese thoughts about a French solution, a forced defrock of their own, in other words, their own nuclear weapons. This is a fact well understood by leaders of many political persuasions in Tokyo and also appreciated in Beijing. In other words, Korean lives were hostage to an American nuclear policy of dual containment, deterring the communist enemy with nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea and constraining the Tokyo ally. I'll now go forward. I'm going to skip pages 244 and 245. They reinforce the point that until the 1990s, American strategy in Korea was to use nuclear weapons very early, or at H+1, meaning an hour after the war begins if the North Koreans were making big gains and heading towards Seoul. It's quite a harrowing scenario, and I hope you will all read it if you haven't. Now to the top of page 246. Of course, 28,000 American troops remain in Korea today, and even though there are not, as far as I know, any American nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea, any day of the week a Trident sub or a B-2 stealth bomber can be deployed to the Korean theater, as President Obama did during the recent crisis. Meanwhile, the American media almost always choose to ignore this long history and focus instead on how provocative, dangerous, and even crazy the North Koreans are. But I think that with a now nuclear North, since 2006, Americans are reaping the whirlwind of our own nuclear threats and blackmail going back to 1951. The armistice after 60 years. Earlier this year, the North Koreans announced that the 1953 armistice would be null and void as of March 11, 2013. At a subsequent White House news conference, a reporter asked this question: will you then still be at war with North Korea? And the answer, quote, I don't want to get into the legal implications of something that hasn't happened yet. We just urge that it not happen. March is a significant month for the armistice because in March 1991, the North Koreans balked when the American commander appointed ROC Army Major General Hwang Won-tak as the U.S. ROK senior member to the Military Armistice Commission. This was after a straight line of 55 American officers had been in that same position since 1953, when South Korea refused to sign the armistice. The North Korean argument was the South Koreans had not signed the armistice, so how can they put a South Korean general in to enforce the armistice? A 3-year freeze followed, with North Korea threatening to completely end the armistice, until finally they developed on the North Korean side a different organization, the Military Armistice Commission, and then they began holding meetings again. Let me conclude this paper with 2 contemporary examples of the dire straits that we are in today with the armistice, because of the abject failure of all the major parties to bring a true and lasting peace to the Korean Peninsula. One is from a source always assumed to be lying through its teeth, the Korean Central News Agency. The second is from an editorial published in the American paper of record, the New York Times. I ask you to determine which party is telling the truth and which sounds rational and which is irrational. At the height of the recent crisis on April 8th, the North issued a white paper discussing American nuclear threats against them. Every one that they listed comes out of what I just got done saying: the introduction of Honest John and 280 millimeter atomic artillery pieces into South Korea, F-16 fighter bombers, B-1B long-distance bombers, nuclear submarines coming up to the Korean coast. They say that in 1994 the U.S. rehearsed a nuclear war with the involvement of up-to-date strike means with Op Plan 5026, that's correct. They planned to bomb the Yongbyon facility in a preemptive attack. I don't know that it would have been a nuclear attack, but that's correct. In September 2002, the Bush administration adopted a new national security strategy in which it put the DPRK on the list of preemptive nuclear attack. And then they mentioned President Obama sending nuclear-capable bombers to the peninsula in April. To the best of my knowledge, these facts are true, even if the way North Korea characterizes the American and South Korean intent is false and exaggerated. But this white paper got no attention, none whatsoever, in the American media. 4 days later, historian Jeremy Suri argued in the New York Times that President Obama, and this was the title of the article, bombed North Korea, before it's too late. After listing various threats from the North, including putting a satellite into space in December and testing a third nuclear device in February, Professor Suri wrote, quote, "The Korean crisis has now become a strategic threat to America's core national interests. The best option is to destroy the North Korean missile on the ground before it is launched." He then goes on to say, "A war on the Korean Peninsula is unlikely after an American strike, but it is not inconceivable. The North Koreans might continue to escalate, and Mr. Kim might feel obligated to start a war to save face." This is what Professor Suri is saying. We preemptively attack North Korea, and if they respond, they started a war. If a nuclear war were to result from this preemptive strike, so be it. It would be Pyongyang's fault. Suri, of course, made no mention of Obama's provocative drops of dummy nuclear weapons from B-52 and B-2 stealth bombers. This is an Orwellian logic that can only come from a person who has no knowledge of the nearly 70 years of conflict between the U.S. and the DPRK, finds no North Korean interest that is worthy of his respect, and seems utterly callous to the millions of lives that would be lost in a new war. Now, you may think Jeremy Suri is a minor professor at a remote location in Texas, and you would be right about that. However, the Clinton administration, under the advice of Defense Secretary William Perry and his aide Ashton Carter, essentially worked out this very same scenario in 1994. To take out Yongbyon with a preemptive strike, and if that led to a new war, they were willing to take that risk. Literally one of the most dangerous moments in June 1994 in recent American-Korean relations. Let me end my paper by saying that for American presidents of both parties, whether Bush or Clinton or others, to contemplate unprovoked attacks against the North is both a stunning example of American arrogance and an astonishing admission of failure going back 7 decades. The failure to remove the risk of war in Korea and to make peace with an adversary determined to wait us out forever if that's what it takes. Chris Marker, who, as I said, passed away in July of 2012, said, and I'm quoting it, "If I ever had a passion in the field of politics, it's a passion for understanding, which immediately put me on the side of the people who seek and make mistakes, as opposed to those who seek nothing except to conserve, defend themselves, and deny all the rest." End of quote. So we end with an epitaph for Americans, North Koreans still recalcitrant and hostile, still thumbing their nose at us, still defying every American expectation and wish that they erase themselves, and Americans refusing to seek an understanding with their old adversary, always defensive about their own actions and responsibilities, always denying any hostile intent toward the North, and still with no passion for understanding. So we remain steeped in denial about a war that is both 60 years old and always within an inch of breaking out again. I'll call your attention to that last statement that is from Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta in the spring of 2012. He said, "We have been within an inch of war with North Korea for days and weeks, or weeks and months, I don't remember it, but within an inch of war with North Korea." It's just appalling that 60 years after that armistice was signed, we still remain in a situation where war could break out in any minute. And the Korean people in North and South, nearly 80 million of them, are held hostage because of that. Thank you very much.
예, 커밍스 교수님 감사합니다. 한국전쟁과 이후에 한국의 원자폭탄이 떨어질 수도 있는 위기, 그리고 핵무기 배치, 그리고 우리가 지금도 여전히 전쟁의 위협에 살고 있다는 거를 잘 설명해 주셔서 아마 여러분들도 들으시면서 굉장히 등골이 오싹해지셨을 거라고